I'm Natalie, a 48-year-old single mother and business owner. When my daughter Lindsay demanded an extravagant $150,000 wedding, I refused to bankrupt myself for one day of celebration. She immediately cut me off completely. Then, out of nowhere, I received a family reconciliation dinner invitation. My heart filled with hope until I arrived to find three attorneys with legal documents instead of a warm reunion. Lindsay looked at me smugly and said, "Sign over power of attorney or you'll never see your grandson again." I calmly reached into my purse, dialed a number, and said, "Before I continue my story, let me know where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button if you want more real-life stories about standing up for yourself when family crosses the line." My story with Lindsay begins 27 years ago, when I found myself pregnant at 21. Her father disappeared as soon as he heard the news, leaving me alone to figure out parenthood with no support system. My parents had passed away in a car accident when I was 19, and I had no siblings or extended family to lean on. I was terrified but determined to give my baby a good life. Those early years were incredibly tough. I worked 3 jobs simultaneously to keep a roof over our heads and food on the table. During the day, I answered phones at a small interior design firm. Evenings, I waited tables at a local restaurant. Weekends, I cleaned houses for extra cash. I would collapse into bed each night exhausted, but grateful that Lindsay was healthy and safe. When Lindsay turned 3, I managed to enroll in night classes at the community college, studying business and interior design, while juggling childcare and my jobs. There were nights I survived on 2 hours of sleep, but watching my daughter grow kept me going. I graduated when Lindsay was 7, and that certificate changed everything for us. The owner of the design firm where I worked recognized my potential and became my mentor. She taught me everything about running a successful interior design business. By the time Lindsay was 10, I had started my own small company. It began with budget makeovers for middle-class families, but gradually grew into something substantial. By Lindsay's teen years, we had finally moved from our tiny apartment to a modest but comfortable home in a good school district. Despite our initial struggles, Lindsay had a privileged upbringing compared to mine. I made sure she never went without necessities, and as my business grew more successful, I could provide her with extras too. Music lessons, dance classes, new clothes instead of thrift store finds. I wanted her to have the childhood I never had, while still teaching her the value of hard work and gratitude. Throughout her childhood and teenage years, Lindsay and I shared an incredibly close relationship. We had our weekly movie nights with homemade popcorn, and I never missed a school performance or sports game despite my busy schedule. I treasured our summer road trips, where we'd explore different states, staying in modest motels, and making memories that didn't require luxury. Lindsay seemed to appreciate our life, and often told me how proud she was of what I had built for us. Everything changed when Lindsay met Jackson during her junior year of college. He came from old money with a family that valued status above all else. The Prestons owned multiple properties, vacationed in exotic locations, and moved in social circles I had only read about in magazines. They were charming on the surface, but I quickly sensed their judgment about my self-made success versus their inherited wealth. Slowly, I watched my down-to-earth daughter transform. Designer labels replaced her thrift store pride. Conversations about meaningful experiences shifted to discussions about material possessions and social connections. The Lindsay who once volunteered at homeless shelters now talked about charity galas, where you paid $5,000 a plate to be seen with the right people. Jackson himself wasn't necessarily a bad person, just incredibly passive and completely dominated by his family's expectations. He had never worked a real job, instead holding a vague, executive position at his father's company that seemed to involve little actual responsibility. He deferred to Lindsay on most decisions, but the unspoken expectation that she would maintain the lifestyle his family deemed appropriate created constant pressure. When Lindsay announced she was pregnant at 24, I was initially concerned about her readiness for motherhood. But the moment my grandson Michael was placed in my arms, all worries melted away. I fell completely in love with that tiny, perfect human. During Lindsay's difficult pregnancy and the exhausting newborn phase, I was there every step of the way. I rearranged my work schedule to help with night feedings, cooked nutritious meals, and provided emotional support when Lindsay struggled with postpartum anxiety. This was when the first real tensions in our adult relationship emerged. Lindsay and Jackson lived in a sprawling house purchased by his parents, with a nursery that looked like it belonged in a design magazine. They hired a night nurse and part-time nanny despite neither of them working demanding jobs. When I suggested that spending more one-on-one time with the baby might be beneficial for bonding, Lindsay accused me of judging her parenting choices. When I mentioned research about minimizing screen time for infants, she said I was being old-fashioned and controlling. Still, I treasured my grandmother role and tried to respect their boundaries while offering support. Little Michael became the light of my life, and I hope that parenthood would help Lindsay reconnect with the values I had tried to instill in her. For a while, it seemed that might happen, as she occasionally expressed gratitude for the parenting wisdom I shared and recognized the challenges of raising a child even with significant advantages. Unfortunately, that period of potential growth was short-lived. As Michael approached his first birthday, Lindsay and Jackson's focus shifted back to external appearances and social standing. The simple joy of watching a child develop was overshadowed by elaborate photo sessions and concerns about getting him into the right preschool programs despite him barely being able to walk. Little did I know that these growing tensions over values and lifestyle were just the beginning of a conflict that would eventually tear our family apart and force me to make the hardest stand of my life. The wedding planning nightmare began on what should have been a joyous occasion. Lindsay and Jackson had been together for 3 years when he proposed with a diamond ring that cost more than my first house. I was genuinely happy for them, despite my reservations about their lifestyle. When Lindsay called me screaming with excitement, I shared in her joy without hesitation. "Mom, we're thinking June at the Bellevue Hotel," she gushed during our first wedding planning lunch. "It's the only venue worthy of our special day." I nodded supportively, though I knew the Bellevue was the most expensive venue in our area. "That sounds lovely, sweetheart. I want to contribute to your wedding. I've set aside $30,000 for when this day came." For a moment, Lindsay looked surprised, then slightly disappointed. "That's a start, I guess. But this is going to be the social event of the season." I should have recognized the warning signs right then, but I was too excited about planning my only daughter's wedding to see clearly. Over the next few weeks, Lindsay's vision spiraled into something unrecognizable to me. She hired Vivian Parker, the most exclusive wedding planner in the state, known for celebrity weddings and extravagant productions. During our first meeting with Vivian, I struggled to maintain my composure as they discussed custom hand-painted invitations at $80 each, ice sculptures for each table, and flying in a specific type of orchid from Thailand that would only be in season for a week during the planned wedding month. "And for the dress," Vivian continued smoothly, "I've arranged for a private showing with Marcella Fontaine when she visits from Paris next month. Her custom gowns start at $25,000, but she's a genius with silhouettes." I nearly choked on my tea. $25,000 for a dress she'll wear once? Lindsay shot me an irritated look. "Mom, this is my wedding day. I deserve the absolute best." The situation reached its breaking point when Vivian presented the comprehensive budget during our third meeting. She laid out a leather-bound portfolio with gold-embossed lettering and flipped to a spreadsheet that made my blood run cold. "The total investment for the wedding experience comes to $150,000, Vivian announced with a practiced smile. "That includes everything except the honeymoon, which we typically plan separately." An uncomfortable silence filled the room. I stared at the number, trying to process it. That amount represented years of hard work, a significant portion of my retirement savings, and more than I had spent on Lindsay's entire college education. "That's perfect," Lindsay said before I could speak. She turned to me with an expectant smile. "Right, Mom?" "Lindsay, we need to discuss this privately," I said as calmly as possible. "This is well beyond the budget we discussed." Once we were alone in my car, the real conversation began. "Honey, I simply cannot afford this. $30,000 is already generous. I'd be depleting my retirement to pay for anything more." "But Jackson's family expects a certain standard," Lindsay protested. "Everyone in their circle has weddings like this, or better." "Then perhaps Jackson's family should contribute more," I suggested reasonably. "They certainly have the means." Lindsay's face flushed. "They're contributing to our honeymoon in Bali and the down payment on our new house. Besides, tradition says the bride's family pays for the wedding. Tradition from when women couldn't own property and weddings cost a fraction of a house, I countered. Times have changed, Lindsay. So have weddings. Over the next few weeks, I proposed numerous compromises. A beautiful but less exclusive venue, a designer dress from a previous season at a steep discount, locally sourced flowers instead of imported varieties. With each suggestion, Lindsay became more resistant and hostile. The tension between us grew until Lindsay invited me to dinner, supposedly, to discuss a new compromise. Instead, I found myself ambushed by Lindsay Jackson and his parents at an upscale restaurant. Margaret Preston Jackson's mother spoke with practiced condescension. Natalie, we understand you're finding it difficult to provide the wedding Lindsay deserves. Perhaps you should consider a home equity loan. Our financial advisor would be happy to discuss options. I was stunned by the audacity. I'm not going into debt for a one-day celebration no matter how special. I've offered a generous contribution that reflects my financial reality. But surely your business could handle a temporary cash flow issue, Harold Preston interjected. Our connections could potentially drive some high-end clients your way afterward. They were offering me potential clients in exchange for bankrupting myself. The conversation deteriorated from there, with Lindsay becoming increasingly emotional and accusatory. You've always been jealous of what I have with Jackson's family, she spat out after her third glass of wine. You pretend to be happy for me, but you're trying to sabotage the biggest day of my life because you never had this yourself. Her words cut deep, but I maintained my boundaries. I love you, Lindsay. I want you to have a beautiful wedding, but I will not jeopardize my financial security or the business I built from nothing to fund an extravagance that will be over in one day. The final confrontation came when Lindsay and Jackson showed up at my home unannounced. Lindsay threw a revised budget on my kitchen table that had barely been reduced, still hovering around $120,000. This is our final offer, she said coldly. Vivian has already secured the deposits to hold the date, which are non-refundable. She expects the next payment by Friday. You made those deposits without my agreement? I asked, incredulous. I knew you'd come around once you realized how important this is to me, Lindsay said with a shrug. You always give me what I need in the end. In that moment, I saw with painful clarity how I had failed as a mother by too often conflating wants with needs. I had worked so hard to give Lindsay everything that I had inadvertently created an entitled adult who couldn't distinguish between necessity and excess. The answer is no, Lindsay, I said firmly. I love you enough to say no when saying yes would harm both of us. My offer of 30,000 stands. Beyond that, you and Jackson will need to adjust your plans or fund them yourselves. Lindsay's face transformed into something I barely recognized. If you don't pay for my wedding, you're not invited. And you can forget about seeing Michael too. I won't have him around someone so selfish and uncaring. She stormed out with Jackson trailing behind her, leaving me standing alone in my kitchen, shaking with a mixture of anger, heartbreak, and surprisingly relief. I had finally established a boundary that was decades overdue. I just never imagined the price would be so devastatingly high. The day after our final confrontation, I tried calling Lindsay, hoping we could discuss things calmly after she'd had time to reflect. My call went straight to voicemail. I sent a text expressing my love and openness to talking whenever she was ready. No response. By the end of the week, I realized with growing horror that she was serious about cutting me off completely. The silence was deafening. For 27 years, rarely a day had passed without communication between us. Now nothing. I tried everything to reach her over the next few weeks. I called Jackson, who awkwardly told me Lindsay had forbidden him from discussing anything with me. I reached out to mutual friends, who uncomfortably admitted they had been instructed not to pass messages. I even sent a handwritten letter expressing my love and desire to work things out. It came back marked "Return to Sender." The only glimpses I got into my daughter's life came through social media, where I watched in disbelief as wedding planning continued at full speed. Through mutual connections, I learned that Lindsay and Jackson had taken out several loans to fund their extravaganza. But the most shocking discovery came 3 months into our estrangement, when I received a call from my credit card company about suspicious activity. Ms. Williams, we're seeing applications for several new credit accounts in your name with different addresses. We wanted to verify this is actually you requesting these cards. My blood ran cold as the representative detailed multiple credit cards and personal loans totaling over $70,000, all applied for using my social security number, birth date, and other personal information. Someone had stolen my identity to secure these loans, and I knew exactly who it was. "These are fraudulent," I told the representative, my voice shaking. "I did not authorize any of these applications." What followed was a nightmarish process of filing police reports, placing credit freezes, and working with fraud departments at multiple financial institutions. Throughout it all, I faced an agonizing dilemma. Pursuing full fraud investigation would likely result in criminal charges against my own daughter. Despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to do that. Instead, I worked with the creditors to clear my name, while being vague about my suspicions regarding who had committed the identity theft. As spring turned to summer, the emotional toll became unbearable. I lost weight, struggled to sleep, and found myself unable to focus on work. My interior design business, which I had built from nothing over 2 decades, began to suffer. I missed deadlines, made uncharacteristic design errors, and struggled to connect with clients. Several longtime customers took their business elsewhere, sensing my distraction. Holidays were the worst. I spent Thanksgiving alone, staring at the small turkey I'd purchased out of habit, unable to eat more than a few bites. Christmas morning, I sat surrounded by wrapped gifts for a grandson I wasn't allowed to see. I had continued buying Michael presents, storing them in a spare bedroom that was rapidly filling with unopened packages marking milestones I was missing. In February, almost 9 months into our estrangement, I learned through a mutual friend that Lindsay had given birth to a second child, a baby girl named Sophia. I hadn't even known she was pregnant. The news sent me into a deep depression that finally prompted me to seek professional help. Dr. Matthews, my therapist, helped me navigate the complex emotions of estrangement. "You're grieving," she explained during one session. "Not just the loss of contact, but the death of the relationship as you knew it and hoped it would be." Through therapy and eventually a support group for estranged parents, I slowly began to rebuild my life. I learned that maintaining my financial boundaries had been healthy, despite the devastating consequences. I focused on strengthening friendships that had fallen by the wayside during years of prioritizing my daughter above all else. Gradually, I implemented systems at work that helped my business recover and even grow despite my personal struggles. Then, exactly 6 months after learning about my granddaughter's birth, an envelope arrived in my mailbox with Lindsay's handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it to find an elegantly designed invitation. "You are cordially invited to a family reconciliation dinner. Thursday, 7:00 p.m., the Westlake Restaurant. Dress business casual." After 15 months of complete silence, this sudden invitation seemed miraculous. I spent hours choosing the perfect outfit, had my hair professionally styled, and purchased thoughtful gifts for both grandchildren. I arrived at the restaurant 20 minutes early, heart pounding with nervous anticipation. The hostess led me to a private dining room in the back. When I entered, my momentary joy shattered. Lindsay sat at the table looking coldly professional in a tailored suit I didn't recognize. Beside her sat Jackson, looking uncomfortable as always. But it was the three strangers with briefcases and stern expressions that made my stomach drop. No grandchildren, no warm embrace. This wasn't a reconciliation at all. "Mom's so glad you could join us," Lindsay said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Please have a seat." I remained standing, clutching my purse and the gift bags I'd brought. "Lindsay, what is this? Who are these people?" "Allow me to introduce Jerome Blackwell, Patricia Vance, and Stephen Morris," she said, gesturing to the three professionals. "They're attorneys who specialize in estate planning, elder law, and family trusts." My confusion must have shown on my face, because Lindsay continued in a patronizing tone. "We're here to discuss your future, Mom. Your financial future specifically." I slowly set down the gifts and took the only empty seat directly across from Lindsay. One of the attorneys the older man introduced as Jerome Blackwell slid a thick folder of documents toward me. "Mrs. Williams, we've prepared a comprehensive set of legal instruments that would grant your daughter power of attorney over your financial affairs, transfer your business interests into a family trust, and restructure your estate planning." I stared at him, then at the documents, then back at my daughter. Lindsay, what is this about? Lindsay leaned forward, her voice suddenly hard. Let's be honest, Mom, you're not getting any younger, and your business decisions lately haven't been the best. Remember that property investment you passed on last year? It's worth double now. And your refusal to expand your client base to the west side has cost you major contracts. I was stunned by her audacity. Yes, I'd made some conservative business decisions, especially during our estrangement when my focus had been compromised. But my company was still profitable and stable, and I was only 48, hardly at retirement age. These documents ensure that the family wealth you've built stays protected, continued the female attorney, Patricia Vance. It's quite common for successful business owners to transition management to the next generation around your age. I have no intention of transitioning anything at this point, I said firmly. My business is doing fine, and I'm in excellent health. Lindsay's expression hardened. That's not entirely true, is it? You've lost clients. Your quarterly revenues are down. And according to your medical records, your doctor recommended anxiety medication last year that you never filled. A chill ran through me. How do you know what my doctor prescribed? Lindsay ignored the question. The point is, you're not as stable as you pretend to be. These arrangements are for your own good. I glanced at Jackson, hoping to see some discomfort with this ambush, but he was studying the tabletop, completely disengaged from the conversation. The third attorney, Stephen Morris, cleared his throat and pointed to specific pages in the document. If you'll direct your attention to sections 3 through 7, you'll see that you retain living rights to your primary residence and receive a monthly stipend from business proceeds. The management transition would be gradual, over 6 months. My mind raced as I skimmed the papers. They had thought of everything. These weren't just power of attorney documents, but a complete takeover of everything I had spent my life building. My business, my investments, even my personal property would all be controlled by Lindsay, and by extension, Jackson's family. When I looked up, Lindsay's expression had changed to one of smug certainty. She clearly believed I would eventually relent, as I had so many times before when she pushed boundaries. But this was different. This wasn't a request for an expensive toy or a last-minute college tuition payment. This was my entire life's work. This is absurd, I said, closing the folder. I won't be signing anything. My business and finances are not up for discussion. Lindsay's false pleasantness evaporated instantly. I was afraid you might be difficult about this. She pulled out her phone and showed me a photo of Michael, now 3, playing with a baby girl who must have been Sophia. You haven't seen your grandchildren in over a year. Wouldn't you like that to change? My heart constricted at the sight of them. Michael had grown so much, and I had never even met my granddaughter. Lindsay saw my reaction and pressed her advantage. Sign the documents or you'll never see them again. It's that simple. The attorney shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. This level of emotional manipulation clearly hadn't been in their professional playbook, but they weren't intervening either. You would use your children as pawns, I asked softly, hardly believing what was happening. I'm being practical, Lindsay replied coldly. You clearly care more about money and control than family, so I'm speaking a language you understand. Sign over power of attorney or you'll never see your grandson again. And you'll never meet your granddaughter at all. The restaurant around us continued its normal dinner service, waiters moving between tables, glasses, clinking diners, laughing. But in our private room, time seemed to stand still, as the weight of Lindsay's ultimatum hung in the air. I felt a strange calm settle over me. With perfect clarity, I realized that this moment had been inevitable, given the boundaries I had failed to establish throughout Lindsay's life. This wasn't just about a wedding anymore. It was about a pattern that had begun when Lindsay was young, and I had prioritized her happiness over teaching her about consequences, respect, and realistic expectations. Without breaking eye contact with my daughter, I calmly reached into my purse, took out my phone, and dialed a number I had programmed weeks ago when I first received the invitation, just as a precaution. David, it's Natalie Williams. Yes, I'm at the meeting now. I kept my voice steady as I spoke to my attorney. The reconciliation dinner turned out to be exactly what we suspected. They have 3 attorneys here pressuring me to sign over power of attorney and control of my business. Yes, the recording is picking up everything clearly. Lindsay's face drained of color. Recording? What recording? I set my phone on the table screen up, showing the active recording in progress. We're in a one-party consent state, Lindsay. Everything that's been said in this room is legally recorded, including your threat to keep my grandchildren from me unless I sign over my assets. The attorney named Jerome Blackwell immediately began gathering his papers. Mrs. Preston, you didn't mention anything about coercion or using grandparent visitation as leverage. Our firm doesn't participate in this type of negotiation. This isn't what we discussed, Patricia Vance added, already standing and closing her briefcase. You assured us this was a mutual decision with your mother's best interests at heart. I continued speaking to my attorney on the phone. David, can you explain to everyone present what the legal term is for what just happened here? I put the phone on speaker as my attorney's authoritative voice filled the room. What you're describing constitutes attempted elder abuse through financial exploitation alongside elements of extortion and coercion. If the recording contains threats to withhold grandchild visitation in exchange for financial control, that compounds the legal issue significantly. The third attorney, who had said little throughout the meeting, was already heading for the door. I want no part of this. Consider our retainer agreement terminated, Mrs. Preston. Lindsay's confidence crumbled visibly as her legal team abandoned her one by one. Jackson finally broke his silence, looking horrified. Lindsay, what have you done? You said your mother was showing signs of cognitive decline and needed our help managing her affairs. You never mentioned threatening her about the kids. I ended the call with a promise to meet my attorney the following morning. The silence that followed was deafening, until I finally spoke, my voice steady despite my breaking heart. I will be leaving now. If you ever want to have a genuine reconciliation, it will begin with an acknowledgement of what happened here tonight and a sincere apology, not just to me, but to these attorneys whose professional reputations you've put at risk. Until then, I'll be pursuing legal measures to protect myself and potentially seek grandparent visitation rights through proper channels. As I stood to leave, Lindsay made one last desperate attempt. You wouldn't sue your own daughter, you're bluffing. I paused at the door and looked back at her with more sorrow than anger. A year ago, you would have been right, but I'm not the same person who let you manipulate her for decades. I love you, Lindsay, but I love myself too. And sometimes, loving someone means holding them accountable. I walked out of the restaurant with my head held high, even as tears began streaming down my face. The cool evening air hit me with the full realization of what had just happened and what was yet to come. The path forward would be difficult, but for the first time in my adult life, I was choosing to value my own well-being alongside my love for my daughter. It was both the hardest and most necessary decision I had ever made. The aftermath of that fateful dinner unfolded rapidly. True to my word, I met with my attorney David Brenner the next morning, bringing the audio recording that captured the entire conversation. David listened with a grim expression, occasionally taking notes or shaking his head in disbelief. Natalie, this goes beyond a family dispute, he said when the recording ended. What Lindsay attempted constitutes elder financial abuse, even though you're not elderly by legal standards. The coercion and threat regarding your grandchildren elevates this to potential criminal behavior. I don't want my daughter to go to jail, I said immediately. I just want protection from further attempts to take what I've built. David nodded understanding. We have options that don't necessarily involve criminal charges. First, we need to ensure your financial security. Over the next 2 weeks, we implemented comprehensive protective measures. I changed all my financial passwords, transferred accounts to new institutions, and set up fraud alerts. David helped me establish a revocable trust with an independent trustee to manage my assets, should I become incapacitated in the future, effectively blocking any future attempts by Lindsay to gain control. We also discovered something shocking when David hired a financial investigator to assess whether Lindsay had already accessed any of my accounts. Not only had she attempted identity theft with credit card applications, but Jackson and Lindsay were drowning in debt, despite their appearance of wealth. They had financed their lavish lifestyle with loans and credit cards, and their magnificent house had an underwater mortgage. The expensive wedding had been the tipping point, pushing them beyond their ability to maintain the financial facade. Most surprising was the revelation about Jackson's family. The Prestons, for all their airs of old money and privilege, were financially extended themselves. Their company had been struggling for years, with multiple properties leveraged against each other. They had been counting on my successful business as a source of future capital, which explained their keen interest in my daughter gaining control of my assets. They've been playing a long game, David explained. Based on these findings, they likely encouraged the relationship with Lindsay from the beginning as a way to eventually access your business success. This knowledge brought clarity, but also intense sadness. Had my daughter's entire marriage been partially motivated by a family's financial desperation? Had Lindsay known about their plans, or was she also being manipulated? The most difficult decision came when David presented me with options regarding the identity theft. The credit card fraud is documented. The companies involved want to pursue charges. I've managed to keep your name out of the report so far, but they're going to need a complainant. After days of soul searching, I made the hardest choice of my life. I allowed the credit card companies to list me as the victim in their fraud cases, but requested minimum penalties. When the detective assigned to the case asked if I knew who might have committed the identity theft, I was honest but merciful. My daughter had access to my personal information and was experiencing financial difficulties. I believe she may have been responsible, but I'm asking for leniency if that proves to be the case. The legal proceedings moved quickly after that. Lindsay and Jackson were called in for questioning about the fraud. When confronted with the evidence, including applications submitted from their home IP address, Lindsay initially tried to deny everything. Eventually, when faced with the possibility of jail time, she admitted to applying for the cards, but claimed she had intended to pay them off without me ever knowing. What I hadn't anticipated was the media attention. Somehow, a local business reporter got wind of the story, the successful interior designer whose daughter attempted to defraud her and then tried to seize control of her assets. The headline in the business section read, "Family Fraud When Success Breeds Betrayal." The article was largely sympathetic to me, portraying Lindsay and Jackson as entitled millennials trying to shortcut their way to wealth. The public exposure seemed to trigger something in Lindsay. She and Jackson launched a counteroffensive, giving interviews claiming I was mentally unstable, vindictive over wedding disagreements, and unfit to be around my grandchildren. They painted me as a controlling mother who couldn't bear to see her daughter happy in a social circle beyond my reach. Their attacks hurt deeply, but I refused to engage in a public battle. When reporters called for my response to their allegations, I simply stated, "This is a private family matter that has unfortunately become public. I love my daughter and grandchildren and hope for healing in the future." The court hearings were excruciating. Sitting across from Lindsay in the courtroom, seeing her refuse to meet my eyes as the judge reviewed the evidence of fraud and attempted financial coercion broke my heart anew each time. Jackson's parents attended one hearing, sitting stiffly behind their son and my daughter, their expressions coldly assessing as though calculating the financial impact of each court ruling. After 3 brutal months of legal proceedings, the judge issued his ruling. Lindsay would receive 2 years probation and be required to complete financial counseling and community service hours, rather than jail time, largely due to my request for leniency. She and Jackson were ordered to pay restitution for the fraudulent charges and legal fees. Most painfully for Lindsay, the judge granted a temporary restraining order, preventing her from contacting me regarding financial matters or coming to my home or business for 6 months. As for my grandchildren, the judge acknowledged my legitimate interest in maintaining a relationship with them, but noted that without a history of serving as their caregiver, my legal standing for grandparent visitation rights was limited in our state. He strongly encouraged family counseling and mediation before considering formal visitation orders. As we left the courtroom after the final hearing, Lindsay brushed past me without acknowledgement, her face a mask of resentment and humiliation. Jackson paused briefly, looking like he wanted to say something, but then hurried after his wife when she called his name sharply from the hallway. I stood alone in the emptying courtroom, the victory feeling hollow. I had protected myself legally and financially, but at what cost? The relationship with my only child lay in ruins, and my grandchildren remained beyond reach. As I gathered my belongings, the court bailiff, an older man who had been present throughout the proceedings, approached me. "My mother went through something similar with my sister," he said quietly. "It took 5 years, but they found their way back to each other eventually. Don't lose hope." His simple kindness brought tears to my eyes. Hope was in short supply, but it was all I had left to hold on to as I walked out of the courthouse into an uncertain future. The months following the court proceedings were a time of profound grief and unexpected growth. I moved through my days like a sleepwalker, at first going through the motions of running my business and maintaining my home while feeling emotionally numb. The silence in my house echoed with the absence of family visits and phone calls full of my grandson's chatter. My therapist, Dr. Matthews, helped me name what I was experiencing. "You're going through a complex grief process," she explained during one particularly difficult session. "You haven't lost your daughter to death, but you've lost the relationship you had and the future you envisioned. That kind of ambiguous loss can be even harder to process than a clear-cut ending." Slowly, I began rebuilding my life with intentional choices rather than simply reacting to the crisis. I committed to therapy twice weekly, focusing on understanding the patterns that had contributed to Lindsay's sense of entitlement and my difficulty setting boundaries. The revelations were often painful. I confused giving things with giving love. I admitted during one breakthrough session, "I thought providing everything she wanted would make up for the absence of her father and our early struggles. Instead, I taught her that love means getting what you want materially, not being supported in becoming your best self." As I worked through these realizations, my business began to suffer from my divided attention. Several long-term clients gently suggested I might need a break, and my quarterly revenues dropped alarmingly. Rather than panicking, I made the difficult decision to scale back operations temporarily while I focused on healing. I brought in Marissa, a talented young designer, who had worked for me for 3 years as a partner rather than an employee. She brought fresh energy and ideas, taking over client meetings, while I focused on the creative aspects I still loved. This decision, born of necessity, ended up revitalizing my company in unexpected ways. Marissa's contemporary perspective balanced my years of experience, and together we began attracting a broader range of clients than I had served alone. Outside of work, I forced myself to reconnect socially after months of isolation. I reached out to old friends I had neglected during the years when Lindsay and her family had consumed most of my non-working hours. Some relationships couldn't be salvaged, but others bloomed again with surprising resilience. My college roommate Diana, who had moved back to the area after her divorce, became a particularly important support, showing up with takeout food on evenings when cooking for one seemed too depressing to contemplate. 6 months after the court hearings, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I signed up for a 3-week tour of Italy, something I had dreamed of doing for decades, but had always postponed for various reasons: family obligations, business demands, saving for Lindsay's education. The trip terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure. I had never traveled internationally alone, had never been away from my business for more than a week, and had certainly never invested so substantially in my own pleasure and education. Those 3 weeks in Italy transformed me. Wandering through ancient ruins and the world-class museums, I rediscovered my passion for art and design beyond the commercial applications that had dominated my career. Sharing meals with strangers who became friends by dessert, I remembered the joy of connection without expectation or shared history. Navigating foreign train schedules and language barriers, I developed a confidence in my own capabilities that years of professional success had somehow never fully instilled. I returned home with a clarity I hadn't possessed before. I didn't want to simply survive this family rupture. I wanted to create something meaningful from the pain. After considerable research, I approached the local community college about teaching a workshop on financial literacy for women, particularly single mothers. To my surprise, they not only accepted my proposal, but offered to make it a regular part of their continuing education program. Teaching those workshops connected me with women facing challenges similar to those I had overcome as a young single mother. Their determination and courage inspired me, and I found myself sharing not just financial strategies, but life lessons about balancing generosity with boundaries when raising children. Without planning to, I had found a community that understood aspects of my journey in a way even my closest friends couldn't fully comprehend. Another unexpected development came through my involvement with a nonprofit organization called Silver Bridges, which provided support for older adults experiencing family estrangement or elder abuse. What began as a donation in gratitude for resources they had provided during my own crisis evolved into regular volunteer work and eventually a position on their advisory board. Working with other estranged parents and grandparents helped me feel less alone in my situation and gave purpose to my experience. Through Silver Bridges, I met Grace, a retired psychologist who had written extensively about family estrangement. With her encouragement, I began documenting my experience initially as a therapeutic exercise, but eventually with the idea of contributing to a book about financial boundaries within families. The writing process forced me to articulate complex feelings and recognize patterns I might otherwise have missed. Your story illustrates something essential that many parents struggle with, Grace told me after reading my draft chapters. The tension between generosity and enabling, between supporting your child and allowing natural consequences. These are universal challenges, but few people discuss them honestly. As my volunteer work expanded and my business partnership with Marissa stabilized into a successful new phase, I found myself creating a fulfilling life I never would have chosen, but had come to deeply value. The constant ache of missing Lindsay and my grandchildren remained, but it no longer defined my days entirely. 18 months after our courtroom encounters, I was having coffee with Diana when she hesitantly mentioned running into Jackson at the grocery store. "He asked about you," she said carefully, watching for my reaction. "He seemed genuinely concerned about how you were doing." I absorbed this information quietly, uncertain how to feel about this indirect contact. 2 weeks later, a card arrived in the mail, handwritten but unsigned. The message was simple: "Thinking of you. Things are changing. Give us time." I recognized Jackson's handwriting from birthday cards he had signed in happier days. The card took up residence on my bedside table, a small beacon of possibility that I tried not to invest with too much hope or meaning. I continued building my new life day by day, allowing myself to find joy in teaching, volunteering, occasional dating, and rediscovering passions I had set aside during the all-consuming years of single parenthood and career building. Then, almost 2 years to the day after the disastrous reconciliation dinner, my phone rang with Lindsay's number. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding, wondering what new crisis or accusation might await. After 4 rings, I answered with a simple, "Hello, Lindsay." The voice that responded sounded smaller and more tentative than I had heard from my daughter in many years. "Mom," she said, the word ending on what sounded like a suppressed sob. "I think I need to talk to you, in person, if you're willing." Then those words opened the door to the next chapter of our story, one that would require caution and courage in equal measure. 2 years after that fateful dinner with the lawyers, my life had transformed in ways I never could have imagined. My business partnership with Marissa had evolved into a thriving company with a waiting list of clients. My volunteer work with Silver Bridges had expanded to include speaking engagements at conferences about financial exploitation within families. The book I had co-authored with Grace about setting healthy financial boundaries had just been published by a small press with modest but encouraging sales. Most significantly, I had rediscovered myself as an individual with interests, friendships, and purpose beyond my identity as Lindsay's mother. When Lindsay called requesting to meet, I suggested a public garden near my office-neutral territory that would allow us privacy without the intensity of meeting at either of our homes. As I waited on the designated bench watching butterflies flit between late summer blooms, I rehearsed the boundaries I had established with Dr. Matthews about this potential reconciliation. I would listen openly, but protect my emotional and financial well-being. I would not agree to anything in the moment without time for reflection. I would maintain hope while acknowledging the reality of our difficult history. Lindsay arrived precisely on time, a punctuality she had rarely demonstrated in the past. Her appearance shocked me. The designer clothes and perfect styling that had become her uniform were replaced by simple jeans and a plain sweater. Her previously highlighted hair was now its natural brown pulled back in a simple ponytail. Most striking was her expression of vulnerability I hadn't seen since she was a child. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, sitting at the opposite end of the bench, maintaining careful distance. "Of course," I replied, fighting the maternal instinct to reach for her hand. "I've missed you." Lindsay nodded, her gaze fixed on the garden path. "I've missed you too, more than I allowed myself to admit for a long time." What followed was a halting explanation of the past 2 years. After the court case and public humiliation, Jackson's family had distanced themselves, embarrassed by the negative publicity. Financial reality had come crashing down as creditors pursued repayment of their substantial debts. The magnificent house had been foreclosed upon, forcing them to move to a modest apartment. Jackson's position in his father's company had been eliminated in a family business restructuring. "We hit rock bottom about a year ago," Lindsay explained. "Jackson started drinking heavily. I was popping anxiety pills like candy. We were fighting constantly, usually about money, but really about everything. The kids were picking up on the tension. Michael started having nightmares, and Sophia developed this nervous habit of pulling at her hair." The breaking point came when Michael, then 4, asked why they couldn't visit Grandma anymore. Lindsay's fabricated explanation that Grandma was mean and didn't want to see them prompted an unexpected response from her son. "But Daddy said Grandma loves us, and you were the one who made her go away." "That night was the worst fight Jackson and I ever had," Lindsay continued. "He finally told me he'd never agreed with how I handled the wedding situation or anything that followed. He said he'd been too weak to stand up to me or his parents, and he hated who we'd both become." The next morning, Lindsay had found herself alone with the children, Jackson's wedding ring left on the counter, alongside a note saying he needed time to figure out who he was, apart from his family's expectations and her demands. His departure had forced Lindsay to face realities she had been avoiding for years. "I couldn't afford our apartment on my part-time event planning salary," she explained. "I couldn't keep up the pretense that everything was fine. I had to apply for assistance programs I once looked down on. It was the most humbling experience of my life." With nowhere else to turn, Lindsay had moved in temporarily with her friend Amanda, sleeping on a pull-out sofa while her children shared the spare bedroom. She got a full-time job as an administrative assistant and enrolled in community college courses to develop marketable skills. Most significantly, she began therapy initially to process Jackson's departure, but eventually to understand the patterns that had led to their family breakdown. "My therapist helped me see how I'd been using material things to fill emotional voids," Lindsay said. "How I'd confused love with indulgence, both in how I expected to be treated and how I was raising my own children." After 6 months of separation, Jackson had reached out, sharing that he too was in therapy and working at his uncle's construction company, rather than returning to the family business. They began cautious couples counseling, rebuilding their relationship on a foundation of honesty rather than appearances. 2 months ago, they had reconciled moving into a small house they could genuinely afford on their combined realistic incomes. "We're divorced from my in-laws financially and emotionally," Lindsay said with a hint of her old spark. "Jackson says it's the healthiest decision he's ever made. His parents are furious, of course, but they have their own problems now that their company is being audited for tax irregularities." Throughout Lindsay's story, I listened without interruption, noting the absence of blame or entitlement in her narrative. When she finally fell silent, I asked the question that mattered most to me. "And where do I fit into this new life you're building?" Lindsay met my eyes directly for the first time. "I owe you an apology that can never be adequate for what I did. The fraud, the manipulation, the threats about the children, the public attacks on your character, all of it was inexcusable. I can't undo any of it. All I can say is that I'm deeply ashamed and profoundly sorry." Her voice broke, and she continued through tears. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect you to trust me again. but I want you to know that I'm working hard to become someone different, someone better. And I'd like my children to know their grandmother. If you're willing to be in their lives in whatever way feels safe for you." The sincerity in her voice touched something deep within me, but the hard-won wisdom of the past 2 years kept me from rushing toward reconciliation without careful consideration. "I appreciate your apology," I said gently, "and I would love to know my grandchildren. But rebuilding trust will take time and consistent action, not just words. I suggest we start very small, perhaps a supervised visit with the children in a neutral location, and separate sessions with a family therapist to work through our history." Lindsay nodded, wiping at her tears. "That sounds reasonable. More than fair, actually. Jackson and I have discussed this, and we're prepared to follow your lead on how to proceed." We parted with a tentative hug, the first physical contact we'd had in over 2 years. I watched her walk away, her posture straighter than when she'd arrived, as though unburdened by finally speaking her truth. I remained on the bench for a long time afterward, processing the conversation and acknowledging the complex emotions it evoked, hope tinged with caution, joy shadowed by painful memories. The reconciliation process unfolded gradually over the following months. Our first family therapy session with Dr. Levine, a specialist in family estrangement, established clear parameters for rebuilding our relationship. Lindsay and Jackson committed to complete financial independence from me, including signing legal agreements drafted by my attorney that explicitly protected my assets. In return, I agreed to regular, initially supervised visits with my grandchildren. My first reunion with Michael and Sophia took place at a children's museum neutral territory, where the excitement of interactive exhibits could buffer any potential awkwardness. Michael was initially shy, hiding behind Jackson's legs and peeking out with curious eyes. At 5, he had only vague memories of me, reinforced by photos Lindsay had recently begun showing him again. 3-year-old Sophia had no memory of me at all, regarding me with the cautious interest she might show any new adult in her life. "Your grandma brought something special for you," Lindsay prompted, when the initial introductions felt strained. I crouched to their level and opened my bag, removing 2 carefully wrapped packages. "I heard you like dinosaurs," I said to Michael, presenting him with a book about paleontology appropriate for his age. "And you," I said to Sophia, "I heard you love to draw." Her gift was a set of washable markers and a sketchbook with animals embossed on the cover. The thoughtfully chosen presents, based on information Lindsay had shared about their current interests rather than expensive toys designed to impress, signaled the different approach we were all trying to establish. By the end of our 2-hour visit, Michael had asked me to read his new book 3 times, and Sophia had climbed into my lap to show me her colorful creations. As we navigated this careful reconciliation, I maintained the boundaries that had become essential to my well-being. I declined invitations that didn't fit my schedule, even when Lindsay expressed disappointment. I continued my volunteer work and teaching, making it clear that while family was important to me, it was no longer my sole focus. When Lindsay once slipped into her old pattern, hinting about needing money for Michael's private school application, I calmly redirected the conversation to public education options in their district. The true test of our new relationship dynamic came 6 months into our reconciliation process. Lindsay called one evening, her voice tight with stress. "Jackson's car broke down. The repair estimate is $3,000 we don't have right now. We're trying to save for a house down payment, and this would wipe out our emergency fund." I waited, saying nothing, curious how she would continue. After a moment's silence, Lindsay added, "I'm not asking for money. I just needed to vent to someone who would understand. We're looking at public transportation options while we save up for the repair, but it means Jackson's commute will be 90 minutes each way." Her clarification represented genuine growth, and I acknowledged it. "Thank you for sharing that with me. It's a tough situation. Would it be helpful if I researched reliable mechanics who might offer payment plans? Or I could pick up the kids from daycare 1 or 2 days a week to give you some flexibility with your schedules." The offer of practical support rather than financial bailout established a healthier pattern for our relationship. Lindsay accepted my help with childcare gratefully, and we found that the additional time with my grandchildren strengthened our bonds naturally. By the second anniversary of our reconciliation, we had established a new normal. that honored both our family connection and our individual boundaries. Lindsay and Jackson had purchased a modest home within their means. I had adjusted my work schedule to include regular time with my grandchildren, while maintaining my independence and outside interests. We celebrated holidays together without the materialism and status consciousness that had previously defined family gatherings. Most importantly, we had learned to communicate honestly, even when the conversations were difficult. During one family therapy session, Lindsay articulated a realization that brought tears to my eyes. "I used to think wealth meant having everything you want," she said. "Now I understand that true wealth is wanting what you actually have. Mom, watching you rebuild your life after what I did taught me more than all those years you tried to guide me directly. You showed me resilience and self-respect in action." Her words represented the most meaningful apology she could offer, a demonstration of genuine change and understanding. In response, I shared my own hard-earned wisdom. I've learned that loving someone sometimes means letting them face the natural consequences of their choices. I enabled your sense of entitlement for years because I confused indulgence with love. We both needed to learn that love with boundaries is stronger and more authentic than love without limits. As we sat in my newly redesigned living room for a simple Sunday dinner, I looked around at the family we were rebuilding. Michael was showing Jackson a science project he'd created at school. Lindsay was helping Sophia arrange flowers in a small vase, teaching her the names of each bloom. The scene was ordinary in the best possible way, lacking the material extravagance that had once seemed so important, but filled with genuine connection. "You know what I think about sometimes?" Lindsay asked, catching my reflective gaze. "What's that?" I responded. "That ridiculous wedding I was so obsessed with. I'm actually grateful you refused to pay for it now. If you had given in, we might never have broken the cycle. Sometimes the best gift is someone brave enough to say no when saying yes would be easier." Her insight touched me deeply, affirming that the painful journey we had traveled together contained valuable lessons for all of us. The relationship we now shared was not the one I had envisioned when she was born, nor was it the one she had manipulated for as a young adult. It was something new, hard-won through heartbreak and healing, and ultimately more authentic than what we had lost. The family we had now was built on respect rather than obligation appreciation, rather than expectation and wisdom earned through painful experience. It wasn't perfect, and we still had moments of tension and misunderstanding. But we had discovered that family bonds, when broken and carefully mended, can become stronger at the very places they were once fractured. Thank you for staying with me through this difficult but ultimately hopeful story. I'm curious, has anyone else experienced having to establish financial boundaries with loved ones? How did you handle it? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, consider subscribing for more real-life experiences about family dynamics and personal growth. Remember that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is maintain healthy boundaries, even when it breaks your heart temporarily. Wishing you all the courage to make the difficult choices that lead to authentic relationships.